different types of sampling and the types of bias. Pretty much those are what the two different topics that we covered. So do you want me to just talk a little bit about the differences? The simple random. Oh, don't worry about the word simple. It's the same as just random. So pretty much simple random. Sorry, yeah, simple. I know. I was looking over it last night, and I'm thinking, why did they put that word simple in there? Just to throw you off, I guess. But that's just the same as random. Oops. Yeah, so just don't worry about that word simple. I guess they just want you to know that there's no rhyme or reason to it. That you can use a table of random numbers, and there's such a thing as a number generator, and you can just run the number generator on your computer, and then like it just the computer will pick the numbers, and then you pick those people. So an example of that would just be like put the names of 250 employees in a hat, and choose 25 pieces of paper or whatever it is. So just choose 25 of them. So it would just be random sampling. So it's just a subset chosen from a larger set, the population. Well, cluster and stratified are different, so let's talk about that. And before I go on, there's one more thing about random or simple random, same thing. Each thing that you're picking has equal probability or chances of being picked. Okay, so like when you put those 25 numbers or names in a hat, they have to be the same size sheet of paper, for instance. So one piece of paper can't be larger than the other because otherwise you would probably pick the larger piece of paper. So when you do random sampling or simple random sampling, which is the same thing, they have equal probability of being picked. So that's an important thing. It's like when you toss a die, the die has to be fair. You can't have like 2 ones on the die and the others and look at the chances of that. Okay, so it does have to be fair, before you pick randomly. Okay, now let's look at the differences in all of these ways to sample, and let's look at cluster first. So cluster is you divide what you have into groups. So you divide the population into groups, and then you choose certain groups. So when you do cluster sampling, it's like you're going to divide your population, let's say, into all these groups, and then you pick this whole group. You choose those two whole groups, okay? So for cluster sampling, divide into groups and pick certain groups. But with stratify, I like to remember it with pictures. You divide into groups, you divide whatever your population is into groups. So you do the same thing, but you choose a proportion out of each group. You choose the same proportion out of each group. So, okay, do the same thing as with cluster. So in that sense, they're the same, but then you're going to pick, say, 10% of each group. So you're going to take a little bit from each group. So let's say 10%. Whereas in cluster, you're only going to pick a few out of those groups. So does that make more sense? I like to just draw a picture because then I think you can see it better. Okay, great. So for stratified, you pick a little bit out of each group. It has to be the same percent. That a proportion is the same as percentage. Or for cluster, you just pick the whole group. And that, so they're a little bit different. And then systematic would be where you choose every nth, say every second person or every fourth person. Choose every nth thing. So choose every, say, 10th person for an example. Okay. Okay, now I guess I could just say a little bit about the bias. There's and then yeah, jump in if you have more questions. The bias is we have self-selection. So bias doesn't really give you a good sample because it's kind of skewed in one direction or another. So the self-selection bias is if, say you have a survey, if you don't like it or if you don't want to take it, you just leave. Survey or study, I guess I could say. Survey or study. If you don't like it, you can leave or not take it. So you're selecting it yourself whether you should take the survey or study or not. Or only show up if you want to do the study. So there would kind of be a bias in that because only people that wanted to do it would do it, and you wouldn't get the other side of the story. Yeah, voluntary response would be a bias because that would also be that you volunteer to do the study. Let me see an example of what you were asked in the homework. Let's see. The example there would be like volunteers. That's kind of the same thing to self-selection about the tutoring program. Let's see. Yeah, they're pretty much the same thing, the voluntary response, because you volunteer for a study only if you want to do it, only if you select it. So let me look at the tutoring. Well, the better example is the CEO of a company asks employees to call an anonymous phone line to report concerns. Well, you self-select that. You only choose, you volunteer to call in. So you have to do the action, and that is a self-selection survey. So those two, you are correct, are the same thing, the voluntary response and the self-selection. Yeah, it's the same exact thing. Voluntary, in survey sampling, voluntary response bias occurs when sample members are self-selected volunteers, as in voluntary examples. So that would be like if you're listening to the radio and they're asking you to call in, giving your opinion, that would be an example of self-selection or voluntary response. And undercoverage is when members are inadequately represented in the sample. So there's like surveys that are done for the presidential election. So I'm trying to think of an example, but the examples could like not count low income voters, which tend to be Democrats. So there's a lot of problems with um, that. You have to be careful on how you survey because you don't want to underrepresent anybody. So if um, undercoverage happens mainly with convenience samples. So if you do a telephone survey, it depends if you have a telephone at your house because a lot of people don't anymore. So that would be more of a convenience. The person that's doing the survey is just picking people that are convenient, like people that have telephones at home, and that would not be your undercoverage. That would be an undercoverage because you're not reaching everybody. Non-response is when individuals choosing for the example are unwilling or unable to participate. So that would be another problem. Example of that would be mail surveys. So when you do something in the mail, a lot of people don't respond because you might have to put a stamp on the envelope. So that would be a bias in that sense too. Right. The ones who do respond are the only ones that get counted. So that's not fair in a lot of the situations. Yeah, like the phone call. Yes. So like the voluntary response bias would be like calling into a radio show that's asking you about gun control or affirmative action, stuff like that. It overrepresents people that have strong opinions. Only people with strong opinions probably are going to call the radio show. So that would be an over voluntary response could tend to overrepresent people. So this week we were just kind of talking about um, how to get a good sample, and then next week, week 5, it talks about how we can test to see if our hypothesis is correct or not. So once we get the sample, then we can talk about the hypothesis we make or what we're trying to study. All right. So this one is like voluntary. Yeah, convenience is just like you stand outside a grocery store and just survey the people that um, walk in about what groceries they like, or stand outside a movie theater and ask what movie they like. So if they're going into a movie, it's kind of biased anyway because they are moviegoers. So you're not catching the people that really don't watch movies that much, but you should get a broad spectrum of everybody. Yeah, I hope this week isn't too bad because I just wanted people to try to start on next week. And next week, I mean, it's not hard, it just has a lot in it, and I wanted to have people spend more time on week 5. So once we get off week 5, week 6 is a little easier also. So kind of gives us a break. Yeah, it's a lot, but just read through it really carefully, really slowly, and it does step you through what you have to do. So there is a lot to it, but you just have to go back to thinking about the normal curve, and we will be using those online calculators or Excel, but don't make it harder than it is. I can do lots of examples next week on the hypothesis testing. And I can answer a lot of questions on email, so no worries. All right, anything else? Okay, good. And the wrap up this week is just mainly opinion. So as long as you justify your opinions. Okay, great. I hope you did, understand the sampling part. So opinions is, and a lot of the homework for people that are going to watch this later, a lot of the homework you have to read really carefully because it says, like, what is the most, let's see, how you really have to read it carefully. There might be, you can argue that there's more than one answer, except that the question says, what is the most relevant? So that means it has to be only one answer. So be careful when it says that. You pick the one that you think is most relevant to the situation. Even though there could be, yeah, those are tricky. Even though there could be more than one answer, you have to pick the one that stands out. And if there are more than one answers, it does say that in the question. So read the question really carefully, because I think there's one or two questions that have more than one answer. I'm just looking through it. Yeah, most relevant. Yeah, you have to be careful there. And one of them says the results of the survey are unreliable primarily. Okay, so you have to pick the best reason. That's just one answer. So pick the best reason. That kind of hung up some people. All right. Well, if you run into anything this week, I'll be on tomorrow night too. So I'll just go over these definitions again and answer any questions. I could go into week 5 if you get into week 5 this week, but I want to save the time in the beginning of the Collaborate for week 4. So I will answer week 5 questions this week, but make sure that I answer everything in week 4. Okay, no problem. Take care. And I guess Summer's here, so if you want to stay, Summer just joined us. Okay, she's joining. She hasn't quite got in yet. Hey, Summer. We were just going over the types of, I did the definitions of all the sampling, and I did some definitions on the bias. So that's all that this section was about. I told the class that you have to read the questions very, very carefully in some instances, because the questions are asking what's the most relevant answer. So there's only one answer. It's the best answer you want to pick. Some questions have more than one answer. So just make sure you're reading the questions really carefully. But I did not get any email questions, so I don't really have anything to cover unless you want to ask some questions. And I said tomorrow, if people work ahead and go into week 5, I can also answer questions about week 5, but I want to make sure that week 5 isn't difficult. It's just there's a lot of material there, and you have to read through carefully. But I will answer problems on week 5. It's just that make sure that I get week 4 answered. I also mentioned that week 4 wrap up is all opinion. So you can express your opinion. It's just you have to have good answers for your opinion or good reasons. So make sure you're justifying your opinions on those questions. It's not a long wrap up. You just have to justify your answers. And I think I didn't mention this, but I think on this week, week 4, if you put all the definitions down in on note cards, I think that would really help also. There's like 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 5 different ways to sample that we talked about, and then there's about 4 biases that we looked at, 4 or 5 biases that we looked at on how to pick a good sample. Next week, we're going to talk about making hypotheses to our study. It's like if you want to study ACT scores and you want to talk about what the probability one group's going to do better than the other, you can make a hypothesis for that, and then we're going to learn how to test it to see if we should stick with what we're studying. So it's pretty interesting section. It's really interesting that there are ways mathematically to test these things. So, but you just have to read through carefully. Like I said, do you have any questions on week 4? Let me check my email real quick to see if anybody. Yeah, no, I don't have any questions, so maybe tomorrow there'll be more. Well, any other questions? Okay, well, I guess I'm going to shut it down today. And then if you think of something, go ahead and email me, please, so I can help. And I'll be happy to go over anything else that you have a question on.